Hey, it's nice to be with everyone. Couldn't have picked a better member minute candidate for today. Our speaker today, David Gessner, is actually a professor at UNCW. William, maybe you had Professor Gessner, who knows? That's something we'll have to unpack later. And hearing about your hiking endeavors and love of the outdoors, I think feathers in perfectly as well. So, y'all, we are lucky today to have Professor Gessner with us. He is the author of 11 books, some of which I'm sure he'll talk about today. And I believe he has a new one coming out towards the end of May. And so I'm hopeful he'll talk a little bit about that. Um, I first discovered Professor Gessner from our friend Ed Robertson's book list, who was with us a few weeks ago. And so, not surprisingly, Professor Gessner is very interested in the outdoors in general, but also some of the same issues of conservation and environmentalism, and in fact, love of nature, and how do we even fall in love with a place in the first place. And so I'm very excited to welcome him. I just can't help but show off that I do have here with me one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years. His My Green Manifesto. Hopefully, we'll speak about that. And then maybe more recently, with a little bit of a Teddy Roosevelt flavor, Leave It As It Is. Y'all cannot recommend these books highly enough. Hope you'll jump on his website and devour them, but don't want to take any more time from Professor Gessner. So with that, I saw him on the call earlier. We'll welcome everyone, give a warm East Chapel Hill Rotary welcome to David Gessner.
Thanks, Nick.
Welcome.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I have the obligatory warped writer's bookshelf behind me here. In response to a couple of the things I was lucky enough to hear. First, William, I don't know if you were there. I was invited to do the commencement a few years ago, and they didn't know what they were doing by inviting me because my main theme was there's no such thing as a Seahawk. That they it's an osprey or a fish hawk, it's not a seahawk. And that rotary in front of school where the wings go up like this is anatomically impossible for an osprey, which has a carpus bone that tilts down. So and in response to Omar's, sadly, I neither boost up or bring down the average age. I'm coming in at a clean 59, and in a week the digit 6 is going to come into play, which is horrifying for me, but it's going to happen. I know some of you have already been there and survived. So I'll kind of follow what Nick said. I'll dwell on my Green Manifesto a little, and I think you'd probably be pretty interested in the Teddy Roosevelt book in the last year. But my book coming out in May is about Henry David Thoreau, and it starts with a scene, which I've recounted quite a few times, where my daughter is now about to turn 18, but back when she was a newborn, we were up in Massachusetts. We used to spend winters in Wilmington, and then we'd migrate back north for a while in the summers. And we'd rent seasonally on Wrightsville Beach and have to clear everything out, put it in storage, and move back up. But so we went out to Walden Pond, which I'm sure some of you have been to, not quite the solitary place it was when Thoreau was there. And I had my daughter up on my shoulders. We were approaching the foundation of where his famous cabin had been. And I said to my daughter, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. And what I meant by that, ruined in a good way mostly, what I meant by that was I read Walden in high school, and all thoughts of ever being on a chamber of commerce or being a lawyer or a doctor kind of flew out the window with that. It kind of infiltrated my brain, and suddenly I had this dream of being a writer. Now, I was also a cartoonist at the time, and I really think that cartooning is why I got into college, because Gary Trudeau was so big with Doonesbury at the time. And so I ended up going to Harvard, which we call up there the Chapel Hill of the North. And I cartooned I wanted to be a writer, but I was going to cartoon first. So I focused on political cartooning. And my editor at the time was Bill McKibben, who some of you will know and recognize as kind of the sage of climate change, one of the first people to delve into it. And he was this tall, somewhat intimidating Lincoln-esque figure. And I'd always bring my cartoons in. Please, Mr. McKibben, can you put these in? And it all went pretty well. And then one evening I came home and I'd had a few beers, and Reagan was the main person I drew at the time because he was president. And suddenly I drew a picture of Reagan urinating on a homeless man in the gutter, and I called it the trickle-down theory, which gave me my first taste in my life of controversy. There was a newly formed conservative newspaper at the college, and all these battles went back and forth, and I was very happy to be in the middle of that. So I got out of college, and I had never, kids who are interested in writing these days take these great workshops, and a lot of them are already really good writers by the time they get out of school. I was not. I had fantasies about being a writer. I had great ambitions about being a writer, but I had never done much actual writing. So I set to writing the great American novel, which I did for the next 5 years while working as a framing carpenter on Cape Cod and in Boston. And it was clunky and it was bad. The old 10,000 hours thing, I hadn't put mine in yet. And I was really a novice. So I had these great delusions, Thomas Wolfe-like delusions of greatness, but the product wasn't so good. In fact, the characters would sometimes quote Thoreau to each other. It was very stilted dialogue. So I sent it out to 5 big publishers, got rejected, turned around and wrote another big clunky novel. And then I won't go into it, but I had grown up in Worcester, Mass, and I ended up moving to Boulder, Colorado when I was 30 to go to grad school in creative writing. And my teacher there said, "You write very autobiographically. Have you ever thought of just cutting to the chase and writing nonfiction?" So here I go, circling back to Thoreau and thinking, I'm going to write about place, because even in my fiction, that is really what exciting to me. I'd kept these journals, that was another way Thoreau influenced me. I've got about 60 of these starting from when I was 17. It's kind of fun to go back and see what you were doing in 1991. But so I started to write a book about living on Cape Cod for a year. It's called A Wild Rank Place. And that's a quote from Thoreau about Cape Cod. But the full quote is, "It is a wild, rank place, and there is no flattery in it." And that reminded me of the Cape, but it also reminded me of my businessman father. He was in textile machinery, and he had kind of a no bullshit philosophy and was very blunt and direct. And it just so happened that he was dying the same year I was staying on the Cape with him. And so the book became both a celebration of place and a kind of memorial to my father, who at the time I knew was dying young. Now, looking back, he was 3 years younger than me. He clearly was very young. So I wrote this book that I thought was this kind of powerful memoir about my father, the blunt businessman, who, by the way, just like me, had moved from Massachusetts when he was 42 to North Carolina. He did it to work for a textile machinery company in Charlotte. I did it to take a job at UNCW. So family cycle continued. So I wrote this thing, and the reviewers were very kind to the book, but they kept calling it a nature book. And this bugged me. I was like, it's not a nature book. It's about my dad's death and about me loving this place. So I turned around, and I'd been living in Boulder when I wrote the book about Cape Cod, but it wouldn't do for a Cape Cod nature writer to be living in Colorado, right? So I moved back to Cape Cod and instantly wrote a book about loving Boulder, which became this kind of polygamous of place pattern with me, where I'd move somewhere else and write about the previous place. So the second book was called Under the Devil's Thumb. If anybody's been to Boulder, there's kind of a giant phallic rock above Boulder called the Devil's Thumb. And so I write this, and it was about regions. I would say that book was. It was about how, for all the McDonald's and planing over of the country, how we're still essentially regional. And that I find kind of a hopeful thing in a way. So for me, moving from Worcester, Massachusetts to Boulder was moving into the open space and becoming kind of a different person out there. But the reviewers, who again were very kind, called it a nature book, which was starting to really bug me. So my third book was called Sick of Nature. It was like, you cannot possibly call this one a nature book. And of course they kind of did, but so all this is going on. And finally, a lot of these books were with smaller presses. And finally, a New York editor calls me because of Sick of Nature and says, you know, I know you're sick of nature, but in there you write well about birds. Could you possibly do a book for us about birds? Well, I didn't want to do a little semi-palmated plover, little precious book, but I remembered that, quick aside, I don't have time to go into it, but I'd had testicular cancer when I was 29, and I had come back, and when I moved back to Cape Cod, and I felt healthy. And I noticed something different about Cape Cod than when I'd been there when I was young. There were these big birds that were back, and they too had recovered from DDT. So ospreys were suddenly back all over the Cape. So I wrote a book about spending a year with the ospreys, embracing finally my nature writing. And it was so intense. It was like I got it in advance. I got money for the first time for writing. So I quit my carpentry job, plopped down with a telescope at a nest, watched the birds cycle through the year, got obsessed with them to the point where at one point I bought fish at the market and was ripping them apart with pliers to get a feel of what it was like to tear them apart with their bill and talons. And my wife said, okay, this is enough. You've gone beyond the bend here. In fact, I think there's a little toy osprey I see back there. I saw it in my own camera. So it's kind of weird. I ended up at UNCW where the Seahawk, AKA Fishhawk, is the mascot. So I kind of accepted my role and kind of grew into it. And I'd always loved being in nature and being outside. So even though my books still were a little on the sarcastic side and edgy, they embraced this kind of part of me. Interestingly, my old editor, Bill McKibben, the Abe Lincoln-like guy, had written the first kind of popular book about climate change in 1989. You might think that as a nature writer, I embraced the book, but I didn't. I'm not a climate denier, but it just troubled me because one of the premises was there's no place you can go in the world where you're away from the human. This is before we started using anthropocentric, the Anthropocene to describe our time. And I hated that. I hated the idea that I couldn't go out on my walks, into the bluff on the beach or into the backcountry in Colorado and get away. Just like if you remember, I know there are a lot of people my age or older on this. The first time you realize maybe I shouldn't be drinking this water from the creek. It's all so connected in that way. So I kind of rebelled against it. And even though I continued to write about place and defending our places and fighting for our places, I dragged my heels a little on the climate issue for that reason. So finally, I decided a few more books came in between. I did a book about the Gulf oil spill. I went down there. It's called the Tarball Chronicles, and I went down during the height of the spill. One of the interesting things I think about that book is my hero was this big hunting fishing guide from Louisiana who was conservative and jokingly called Obama my president. So we had this kind of back and forth. We got along really well, but politically we were quite different. But I allowed him to kind of be the star of that book. But then I got to the book that Nick mentioned, my Green Manifesto. It began as a magazine article. The idea was that I would go up with this guy, Dan Driscoll, who was kind of a intense towny guy who I'd actually met through playing Ultimate Frisbee. We called him Danimal because he was such a wild man. And he had become a big part of the Massachusetts conservation department. And he had, whoops, I didn't know emails popped up. They come everywhere. You can't get away from them. And he had had this idea, which was, I want to rewild the Charles River. And this is a river that winds from Hopkinton, where the marathon starts, into the heart of the city, right? So it's a very urban river in a lot of ways. But Dan realized that practically one way he could do that was to create bike paths. Now, in a way, bike paths don't do that, but in a way, he thought, I will include native plantings with the bike paths. So we kind of Trojan horsed in this environmental vision that the state bought and invested in. And he worked with everybody. He worked with businesses. There's a weird thing that's happened with all American rivers, but with the Charles in particular, which is after World War II, people started turning, rivers had been the thoroughfare before, but after World War II, we started turning our backs on them and dumping in them. And there'd be businesses outside of Boston where, you wouldn't even know that the Charles River were back there. But what Dan did by regreening the Charles was get people to turn back and see this kind of thing they had in the heart of their, they had nature in the middle of their city. So to frame the book, I went with Dan in his old canoe, which broke in half when we tried to jump it over this pipe, and did the length of the Charles. And there was a lot of drinking on that canoe trip, and a lot of, we pulled in, there was behind a bar and tied up and went up and had steaks and drinks and came back down. But the idea was that there's such a thing as the limited wild, that we don't have to be, in Yellowstone or Yosemite, that there's a wildness possible in our backyards, a lesson certainly that we've all been thinking about in the last year, right? And that you can have these moments, these heightened moments of connection with nature without having to, you could have them within your life rather than away from your life. And that was an exciting moment. The other thing the book was me finally confronting climate change. And I did it by saying, look, I still believe, in old environmental fights were a lot simpler, right? Somebody's building something on your favorite beautiful green place. I'm going to fight and I'm going to defend it. The old school Ed Abbey, this. Climate change is a much more complicated fight for all of us. And what I felt at the time, because McKibben's book had been followed by Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, is that it was being presented, and this was almost already 20 years ago, it's been presented as kind of the intellectual equivalent of a panic attack, that we were just saying the world is doomed, and all the books about it were the end of, the doom of. And for me, that was counterproductive, because I felt like you would curl up into the kind of mental equivalent of the fetal position and not do anything and not fight. And you can still fight, you can fight for the Charles River and a small patch of that. And that in its way is as important as fighting for the greater world. I wasn't in any way denying climate, but I wanted to kind of give it a new language and a new way of looking at it that still included a love of green places and animals. I'm just going to read one really not smart, well, maybe smart, section of this book. And then one other thing, and then I'll skip ahead to Teddy Roosevelt and be happy to answer any questions. Lately, I've been giving a lot of talks, and when I speak, people sit listening rapt, or at least putting on rapt faces. I suppose if I really wanted to make it big, I would start spreading the word of doom and intoning the phrase global warming over and over, hitting my audiences with it like a stick. But I've got other ideas, impure and pesky little ideas that get in the way. For instance, sometimes I think that from an artistic point of view, the end of the world might be kind of interesting, at least more interesting than all the dull predictions about it. Another troubling notion is that I'm not really sure I want to be this thing called an environmentalist. I'm not trying to be glib here. I don't think it's unimportant to fight for environmental causes. It's just that I would like to put forth a sloppier form of environmentalism, a simultaneously more human and wild form, a more common sense form, and hopefully in the end, a more effective form. Because the old guilt-ridden mystical enviro speak just isn't cutting it. Maybe the musty way of talking about nature needs to be thrown over a clothesline and beaten with a broom. That's what I've been trying to say at these talks I've been giving. My role as I see it, and pardon my French here, is to try to pull the pole out of the collective environmental ass. It isn't easy work. For a costume, I usually wear a Hawaiian shirt and get into character. To get into character, I drink a few beers. Throughout my talks, I make jokes about how earnest everyone is, and the audience usually laughs along semi-masochistically. Sometimes I get carried away. I start feeling megalomaniacal and believe I am the bringer of a new language. I imagine myself to be Bob Dylan at Newport, playing electric guitar among the folkies, trying futilely to get them to yell out Judas. The last metaphor was confirmed by one of the door prizes I was given recently, a CD tribute to Rachel Carson's work after a talk at a conference in Booth Bay Harbor to celebrate Carson's life and work. On the way home, I listened to a song on the CD that told the story of the Osprey's demise from DDT and then its remarkable comeback, a subject I once wrote a book about. It is fair to say that Carson is one of my greatest heroes, but the music that came warbling out of my speakers seemed to be sung by a caricature of a late 50s Pete Seeger wannabe, who wailed about the poisons coursing through the Osprey's bodies with such excruciating earnestness that it almost made me root for the bird's death. Anything as long as the song ended. This, I found myself thinking, this is part of the problem. Why does nature turn us into this kind of warbler? It makes me long for a new sort of music, a music with energy, irreverence, and drive, a punk Osprey tribute sung by, say, the Sex Pistols. And maybe I think now that's a good place to start, a new music. I haven't read that in a long time, and it makes me see how things have changed since then, what I was rebelling against. Luckily, common sense in the way we are with our cars and our businesses has prevailed a bit. In the time since, I've written a few more books. This one is called All the Wild That Remains. It's about two writers I love out west, Edward Abbey and Wallace Stegner. And most recently, this is my book where uh, I followed Teddy Roosevelt around the country right before the country shut down. I went up the coast to his home on Long Island, went to Harvard where he had gone to school, headed out to the Badlands and camped there for a week. And boy, that was great. Being in, I really feel like that's another thing when you're writing about somebody, you go to the places that matter to that person. That's so important. And then I headed out farther west to Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and it was really exhilarating. As for the epilogue, a year later, I flew in a two-seater plane like all around the interior West. And one thing, it was both kind of depressing because you see a lot of dead trees from beetle kill and a lot of development. But it was also kind of just caused me a lot of hope because you'd fly for half an hour without seeing a human being over forests and mountains. And I'm sure a lot of you have spent time in the American West. I mean, it's just such like a physical embodiment of hope. So that's the geography of hope is what Wallace Stegner called it. So this book came out this September and got a nice blurb from Robert Redford on the back saying it's a rallying cry in the age of climate change. But so, it takes a lot of energy when a book comes out. You got to do a lot of these sort of things. And, you used to do them in person. That was the good old days. But the whole time I was preparing for the book to come out during the pandemic, I had weirdly gone back to reading Thoreau to loop the talk around to the beginning. I started reading Walden again in February, and I rebuilt the writing shack that had been destroyed in Florence behind my house. I have a little cedar shingle kind of hut I built right on the side of Hewlett's Creek, AKA Dawson's Creek, down here. And I also put up an osprey platform out on the marsh. So I always say it was like I was preparing for a test I didn't know I was going to take, because who better to shelter in place with than Henry David Thoreau? So we stayed still through the year mostly. And then my daughter, I started with her going to Walden. I'll end with her. We went back. She's 17. She was 17 with her best friend and my wife. And that was kind of the year-end pilgrimage. And then that turned into, this is just the proof, that turned into this, which is coming out in May. And I also bought my favorite mask, which is my Henry David Thoreau mask, where the lips kind of move and really creep people out, and the beard is similar to mine. So maybe just to disturb you, I'll wear this for the rest of the time because it disturbs people. I could say a lot more, but I really would like to kind of go in whatever direction you'd like to go in the little time we have left, I guess. I don't know how long you guys go. But, it's been this, I mentioned that the Green Manifesto seems a little dated. One thing that's turned me into more of an activist is my daughter and my students. Because, as I said, I'm your age, or the average age here. And a few years ago when I was teaching, one of my writing students basically talked about her anxiety attacks that remind me a little bit of when we were young and we thought about nuclear war. And it was all focused on climate. And then as my daughter got older, she started a group, Sunrise, in the schools in Wilmington, which was like, kid activists for climate change. And one final full circle thing, we're really, you have it too, though I evacuate generally to Durham, Chapel Hill, but we get climate change right in the face every late summer. And after Florence, I came back. I actually headed up to Durham and came back pretty early here. And after Florence, when the school reopened, I brought Bill McKibben down to speak to both the town and the school. So it was kind of like coming around with that. So I'll be quiet now, and any questions you have are on. I haven't talked much about writing, which is, by the way, I'm the chair of the creative writing department down here. We have a BFA and an MFA, the grad program, and it's a great community. It's sad that we're mostly doing this now, though I open up the building on Friday and invite people in to just come and sit in the classrooms and write. That's it for me.
David, thank you for sharing with us. We have a long-standing history of continuing these conversations with questions, and so we want to open it up to questions. Folks, if you'd like to chat your question, or you can raise your hand, or if you don't have anything, if you can't figure out how to do that, you can just speak up and ask.
That's fine, yeah.
David, this is D.G. Martin. I would like for him to talk a little bit about his wife, Nina, who is also a wonderful author who goes between here and New England and blends the cultures. And
yeah,
wonderful, wonderful writer.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that, about Nina. In fact, in the new book, which is I go month by month and have the COVID cases and deaths at the beginning, but also go into our personal story. So about exactly a year ago, this week, we had a visiting writer from Idaho, and we gave her a big party. I just rebuilt the writing shack, and the party, which we now call the last party, was to celebrate Kim Barnes being here, to celebrate my daughter's getting her license, and my impending 59th birthday. I have a week left till the one where 6 comes into play. But mainly the party was to celebrate the sale of Nina's book. So she has written a book that is about Agatha, the previous book, by the way, if I were really honest with kids about writing, I'd say, yeah, it's great. It's a great job to have now, but I didn't publish my first book till I'm 35. And Nina was about the same. it's really true. I mean, there's a lot of struggling involved. But so Nina, the previous book, she hadn't been able to sell it as well as her other books had done. So it'd been like a 5-year kind of time in the desert. So she wrote a book about Agatha Christie's disappearance, which was a mystery of itself, where suddenly when she was a young writer, she disappeared and maybe there was an affair with the husband. And she sent it, fingers crossed, to her agent. Now, probably the average response time between you send something to an agent and you hear back from even the agent or publisher, it can be 6 months, it can be whatever. So she sent it on Sunday night, and Tuesday of that week, or Monday of that week, he read it that night. We got a call saying how thrilled he was. He sent it out immediately, like in the movies. Tuesday, we heard there had been and we've lived pretty skimpily through the years. Tuesday, we heard there was a $500,000 offer for the book. And this is like COVID is just starting, and the world is collapsing and we're supposed to be depressed. And we're like, well, that's, and we're both good friends with her agent. And he said, I'm going to hold out for $1 million for this book. So I was down walking at Carolina Beach on Wednesday, and I'm much more of a blabbermouth than my wife. And the phone rang, and she said he did it. He sold it. In 3 days, he sold the book for $1 million. And she said, you've got to promise not to tell anybody about this and not talk about it. And I said, I promise. I'm walking in the woods, doing the Thoreau thing. A jogger comes by, and I stop him. And I don't know him. I say, excuse me, my wife just sold a book for $1 million. And so it's got its own stresses for sure, because but it's really exciting that, her career is kind of taken off. And, it's been a long fight, so it's great. Yeah. And this book for me is the first time, I've been here for 17, 18 years. It's the first time North Carolina really starts to, that's kind of how writers work, right? You're mining your past, but it takes a while to move forward. But yeah, Nina de Gramont, she's got 8 books herself. They're all in that pile right there in the middle. And The Last September is a beautiful one about Cape Cod. Yeah.
Ron Link has a question.
Thank you, Professor. In light of your comment about the Charles River and looking for nature where you are rather than, we can't all live in Boulder, what are 3 or 4 of your favorite places within, say, a day's drive of Wilmington?
Well, I'll even pull it closer to home because of the pandemic, which has pulled us closer to home, right? That's, in a way, Thoreau is the most famous writer about his own house, so he's the perfect person for this. I'm lucky enough where I can push my kayak off the dock I built back on Hewlett's and get out to Masonboro in about 45 minutes. Now I have to often rush because of the tide to get back in Hewlett's, but and it's not going to come as any surprise to a lot of you that I'm going to mention Masonboro. But what I particularly would mention is Masonboro in the off season and the off weathers and the off times, when suddenly you have a deserted island to yourself and you walk out and you've got 4 miles of beach on either side. And I went out there for an environmental piece with a friend from Boston who flew down and spent a week there in December a few years ago. Now we didn't just go randomly. We saw the weather was fantastic. And boy, I could have been out west. I could have been anywhere. So I write a little bit in this book about the actual environmental moment. I don't think of Wilmington as a particularly environmental town, right? The developers rule to some degree, but the environmental moment when Masonboro was kind of won to remain what it is was one of the great triumphs here. I'm a huge fan of Carolina Beach State Park because in a small space, the diversity of habitats. You get freshwater swamps, you get saltwater marshes, you get ecotones that you're shifting in between. So I get down there a lot too. I have not done as much on the inland, along the Cape Fear, but those are two of my absolute favorite places.
Thank you.
And actually, here's one more, just because it's an easy, obvious thing. If you get there early in the day and in the off season, the south end of Wrightsville, if you park at the farthest, westernmost in that parking lot and go in the far trail, there are green herons that roost there. It's changed completely since I first moved there, where it's more duny. And there's black skimmers that come in, one of the biggest skimmer colonies on the East Coast. So, I love these little hidden patches of nature that you can find.
We'll entertain one last question, and I think Brian Keeliff has that question. Brian?
Excellent. Thank you. Couple of things. One, very humbling to see what your wives can do. Humbling for us husbands, is it not? Yeah. And I found the same in my life. Secondly, how's your behavior changed from all of this? You talk about your daughter changing you. And then lastly, being a teacher, here we are, your audience, your students. What are you going to send us away with in terms of instructions on how, what inspiration are you going to give us?
Okay. Why? Let's see. Let's go through the checklist. Wives being good, yes. Better than us. I remember the last one. What was the second one? Just in a word.
The second one. How have you?
My behavior. My behavior.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say, I have been a reluctant activist. Edward Abbey, one of my heroes, said one brave act is worth 1,000 books. Did he really believe that? His books have gotten a lot of activists to act. I have tried, in the spirit of a group I really admire, the Environmental Defense Fund was essentially formed around saving ospreys on Long Island. I have tried to form groups, within the university and out west, a group called Writers for the Wild, because as an individual, groups are so much stronger than individuals. So I've tried to do that. In my own eyes, I've failed at that. I always kind of cringe when people complimentarily call me an environmentalist. I'm like, well, I'm an environmental writer. And hopefully I've fired some people up. But I don't feel that, my behavior has changed. I've become more of an activist, but I got a long way to go. I've got work to do in the next however, I don't know how many years we have allotted, but the next years. As far as what I tell my students now, it's twofold, because really I'm a writing teacher. So one thing I talk to them a lot about is, keeping your butt in the chair and getting your work done and being creative and creating good writing habits where you don't have to have some rainy day in October when you're inspired, that you can work at it every day. But the way the environment or the world factors into this is, so much of nonfiction for young writers is me. It's about the self. And that's understandable. I mentioned Thomas Wolfe before. First novelists, usually your first topic is you. But what I try to push them to do is look at the world. Look at birds, look at trees, look at the water, look at this, miraculous green world beyond the human. Anthropocentric refers to the inability to see beyond just the human. And I think, especially as we get older, hopefully, and our concerns grow larger, we start to look just beyond ourselves toward the greater world. Is that inspirational enough?
I think you give us a great message. I'm going to go out for a good walk this afternoon. I'll think you.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Great presentation. We're grateful for you being with us today. I wish everybody a great weekend, safe weekend. Enjoy the beautiful day this afternoon, and we will look forward to joining each other again in a week. My best to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.